No, ja, ja, ja.
Well, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the first joint OECD IZA, the Institute for the Study of Labor seminar on the world of labor. I think many of you know me. I'm the Director for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs at the OECD. I'd like to welcome, first of all, Professor Klaus Zimmermann, the Director of the IZA, with whom we have decided to host this joint seminar on the world of labor, but also the other members of the panel. I will introduce all of them properly at the beginning of the session. But let me say that it's really a great pleasure to have the joint seminar with the IZA. At OECD, we look at the policy issues. We look for evidence-based analysis. We provide advice and recommendation to member countries. But I think it is important, more than ever, to engage with experts, to engage with researchers that are dealing with the same issues, with the same policy issues. So I think for us at OECD, this seminar is really a great opportunity to bring together the research community and the OECD experts and colleagues, as well as the ambassadors. There are a number of ambassadors represented from the different delegations, to really engage on a serious discussion about some very relevant policy issues. This is the first seminar we are organizing together with the IZA, but I hope that with Klaus, this will be the first of a series of events we might be organizing. As some of you know, we also organize an annual conference together with the IZA on different labor market issues. This is more a seminar format with a shorter period of time on a specific policy issue. Now, when we were with Klaus discussing about what could be the good topic to launch this new initiative, we, I think, pretty quickly thought that minimum wage would have been a good topic. I think I'm not saying anything surprising to you if this is one of the most controversial issues. It's an issue that, of course, attracts attention from the media, from people in general, but also there's a lot of controversy among economists about the rationale for having a minimum wage, how you set the minimum wage, how you see that interacting with other policy instruments, and so on and so forth. I think there is a paper by the IZA discussion paper, actually by Donald O'Neill, that reviewed the opinion of about 1,000 economists who signed open letter either in favor or against the Fair Minimum Wage Act of 2013 in the US. I think it's an interesting paper because it shows that even in the US, there are completely different views about the idea of increasing the minimum wage from the fairly low level over there. I will just sort of keep this introductory remarks very short. I will give the floor to Klaus for some introductory remarks, but also for him to present the world of labor, this initiative of the IZA, and then we move on to the panel discussion, which we organize in two parts. One, looking more about the evidence, the effect of the minimum wage, in particular in one dimension on employment, but the second, which I think is also very interesting, looking at how to adjust the minimum wages and how to assess how the minimum wage interact with other policy and with other institutions. So from my side, with no further ado, I'll give the floor to Klaus Zimmermann, and then we move on to the panel discussion. Klaus.
Yes. Thank you very much, Stefano Scarpetta, for these words of welcome and also for the willingness to jointly organize that new seminar series. And as a director of IZA, I'm very pleased about this new product. Many of you know what IZA is doing. Nevertheless, I would like to say a few sentences about our vision and mission. We are a privately funded organization, actually funded by the German Postal Service Foundation, not the service itself, but the foundation. And, we are an independent research institute affiliated with Bonn University. But we are also a worldwide platform of labor economists, broadly defined, who are interested to debate research issues with a policy perspective, and that globally around the world. So while we are based in Bonn, our network has, with about 1,300 fellows, around the globe, so to speak, a group of people which can be seen as the largest network of economists. Now, we are interested in real research issues. We publish in research journals, but also want to have an impact on society, want to be useful for society. That complements nicely the work of the OECD, I guess, but in a different way. So we look more into long-run knowledge and what is usable for policy activities. In our ambition, we are not concentrating on developed countries alone, but also dealing with the developing countries. That's why we define labor very broadly. So we have links to public economics, to demography, to developing country issues, to say if you. So the idea is to combine excellent research with concrete advice for society. Now, part of that mission we thought is best fulfilled by this new product, the IZA World of Labor. What is this? What is the objection? Now, maybe the best way to understand it is to understand it as a kind of communication journal. So it produces regularly pieces of 10 pages printed out, so-called policy briefs, which are a very particular format. And it's refereed, it's also copy edited and development edited, so it's heavily in production time, and it focuses on very well-defined challenges or issues of global relevance, which is, as we say, useful for society and which hopefully can generate the debate. It should be based on all the available evidence which the experts can find to support a particular insight. That's the key idea. And the larger group of editors is helping the key staff to produce that in the usual fashion. Well, the world is invited to contribute through, that's a possibility, through the homepage. You can find in the material coming to or with this meeting some information how to reach us and to approach us. Now, who are our partners? Certainly the key partner is at the one side, as a publisher, is Bloomsbury. That's the publishing house of Harry Potter. We hope to get at some time, maybe not as many million readers, but at least as many influential readers around the world for the product. But at the other side, it's also the World Bank, because a very strong part of our mission is to deal with third world challenges. But we present, like today at the OECD, the concept to decision makers, but also to potential authors at various places. So we had been at the IMF, at the World Bank. We have recently been at the LSE, at CEMFI in Madrid, and we will go on to other places like the EU Commission and to Asia, China, and so on. So that's the kind of introduction I would like to give. Now, we like controversial issues. One issue is certainly the field of development, which is not the topic of today, but I'm happy to announce now that the prominent IZA Prize of Labor Economics has been decided just at this weekend, so to speak, and we announced it in this moment. So the prize winner 2014 is Gary Fields from Cornell University, and he stands also for our ambition to support the creation of jobs and good jobs, perhaps many of them with minimum wages around the world, to improve the life of people. So that is thing. Now, as already Stefano said, I don't have to iterate on that. Everybody knows that minimum wages are controversial. So, and there are lots of many insights. We have hundreds of articles in the IZA discussion paper series about minimum wages. And there are a few thousand also paper cites the issue. The articles come to very, very different conclusions. And so I'm very interested to see how today we can confront all these different conclusions with the hard overall evidence which is still existing. So that's at the end the message we want. Whatever the insights of controversial debates can bring, the idea is to see also what are the facts at the end we can really rely on. That's the mission of the IZA World of Labor, but also maybe the mission of this round to find out more about this. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm looking forward to the panel debates and the presentations.
Thank you, Klaus, for your introductory remarks. I'm really pleased to have here with me at the table, I think, some of the most renowned experts on labor economics, I would say, but also specifically on minimum wages in different ways in different parts of their life. I think they've all been significantly or largely exposed to the issues of minimum wages. Let me first of all introduce them, and then we'll say a few words before we kick off our discussion. François Bourguignon, to my left, who is the Emeritus Chair of the Paris School of Economics, a professor at the Paris School of Economics, the Chair of the group of experts of the Salaire Minimum Interprofessionnel de Croissance. Pierre Cahouc and myself are also members of this group. He was a senior vice president at the World Bank, a chief economist, and of course is a leading expert on both the theoretical and empirical analysis around poverty and income distribution. He's also the editor with Tony Atkins of the Handbook of Income Distribution. Then to his left, Richard Dickens, who is professor of economics at the University of Sussex, is also the head of the economics department, and is also a member of an independent member of the Low Pay Commission in the United Kingdom. He's also written significantly about labor markets, minimum wages, inequality, and poverty. To my extreme right, David Newmark, who is professor of economics at the University of California, Irvine, and a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. As many of you know, is a well-known labor economist who has written a lot on minimum wages, including very recently, and I think would be very good also hear his views about the recent proposal to hike the minimum wage in the United States. Now to my right, Klaus Zimmermann. I think he introduced himself. He's a full professor of economics at the Bonn University. He's the director of the Institute for Study of Labor at the IZA. He's honorary professor of economics at the FIU University in Berlin. Has written extensively on very different issues related to labor economics and to migration issues. Now, let me say just a few words just to provide a little bit of the context. And I think what we do perhaps best at the OECD is just to present the international perspective before we go into the different views that the experts have here about the minimum wages. I think the first point to highlight is that when we look at the rationale for statutory minimum wages across countries, you see that different reasons are put forward for the need of a country to have a statutory minimum wages. This is considered to be part of labor standards alongside with others. Could be a complement to collective bargaining wage-setting institutions, in particular when there is a perception that the bargaining power of unions might be declining or be low. It might be a tool, and this will be discussed during the day-to-day, as to reduce inequalities and to reduce poverty, to strengthen work incentive, to make existing redistribution more effective, to boost tax collection and enforcement. And I left a few dots down there because I'm sure that there are also other reasons that have been put forward for the need of country to introduce or to keep a statutory minimum wages. Along the same lines, I think when you look at the effectiveness of minimum wages, I think it is very important. There is an extensive literature that you might have to go beyond aggregate results. You have to look at how the minimum wage may affect different groups. You might not just look at the minimum wage in isolation, but you might want to look at how the minimum wage interact with other policy and institutions that exist in the country. And you have to look at different objectives. Sometimes it's just a focus on employment, sometimes actually as an anti-poverty tool. So, I mean, there are not only different rationale that are put forward, also different ways in which you might possibly look at the way in which the minimum wage affect outcomes in our economies. Now, very quickly, if you look at the evolution of minimum wages across countries, you see very different patterns. Some of the countries that tend to have a fairly high minimum wage relative to the median wage have seen some decline over time. Look at Australia and the Netherlands on the one hand. Other countries that had actually already a fairly low level of minimum wage have seen either a stabilization of the minimum wage relative to the median wage or some further decline, which is the case in the US, for example. And I think France is one of the countries in which, when you look at the gross minimum wage as a share of the median wage, where there has been a significant increase from the mid of the last decade. I think it is very important also to look at the minimum wage from different perspectives. This is the standard way in which we compare at the OECD the minimum wage. So it's when you look at the gross earnings and you relate the minimum wage in terms of the median wage. But I think if you look at the net income, kites, so when you look at actually net income at the minimum wage compared to net income at the median wage, you see that actually the level tend to be higher in some countries more than in others. But I think if you look at the perspective of companies, which is to look at the total cost at the minimum wage compared to total cost at the median wage, you see again that in some countries there is a lower level because of rebates, reduction in, for example, social security contribution. I think with Francois, we are just finalizing our report for the minimum wage commission. This chart was particularly interesting because at France, if you look at the gross minimum wage relative to the median wage, is one of the highest. But if you look at that from the point of view of the cost for an employer, actually it is similar to what you find in a number of other countries. I think it's also very important to bear in mind that there are differences, tax wedge at the minimum wages, whether you look on the one end at the social security contribution for employers, or whether you look also at the income taxes and social security contribution for the worker. This is actually the minimum wage put at 100, and then you see the effects of taxes both on employer and on the employees. And I think perhaps one of the most interesting points is that when you look at the impact of the minimum wage, you're also interested to look at what is, if we raise the minimum wage, what is actually left in terms of take-home pay. Here, the blue part of the bar, for an increase of 5% of the minimum wage, tells you what is left with the worker. So what is the take-home pay increase of the work? And you see that, again, it varies dramatically from one country to the next, depending on the role of tax and benefit systems that may actually take part of the increase in the minimum wage. So I think it is important to go beyond the standard way in which we look at the minimum wage relative to the median wage in terms of gross terms, and look at actually the role of tax and benefit that around the minimum wage play a significant role and differently across countries. So just to again conclude a very quick overview of some of the key issues that we might want to discuss today, I think it is very important when we look at the implication for policy to see what is the impact on the workers, what is the impact in terms of the cost for the employer, how to actually set up the minimum wage in countries like Germany that is thinking of introducing a federal minimum wage, or how to adjust the minimum wage over time, how to sort of involve, for example, external expertise. I think there are a number of countries, including, of course, in France, in the UK, that actually have set up a commission, more or less independent, to actually advise government about possible changes, adaptation of the minimum wage. But I think it's also very important to look at different groups and to look at how actually the minimum wage interact with other instruments which countries have in order to somewhat fight in-work poverty and may have an impact on behaviors of individuals. Some of the issues that I think are not well discussed is also how the minimum wage may affect the incentive for people to train and educational choices, and also how to the minimum wage affect, if you like, the wage distribution across a wider range of wage setting and in different sectors. So these are some of the issues I think we might want to discuss. The way in which we want to organize our seminar today is that we are basically divide the discussion in two parts. First, looking at the minimum wage blessing or curse, the labor market impact. Here we give the floor, I give the floor to David Newmark, who will provide a sort of an overview from his extensive work, and then we'll open up the floor to the other members of the panel here, and then with all of you. And then the second panel will be more about setting, adjusting the minimum wages and the interaction with the other policy. There will be Francois Bourguignon and Richard Dickinson will make some introductory remarks before we actually, again, open up the floor with the other members of the panel and then with you in the audience. So with no further ado, I give the floor to David for his introductory remarks. David.
All right, now it's blank. Now it's the globe.
First step.
We're getting closer. I'll start anyways, because I only have 13 minutes. I assume this will show up here. So this is a summary of a summary of a summary. I've done lots of papers on minimum wages, wrote a book, wrote the IZA World of Labor essay, which is a summary of all that, and this talk is a summary of that essay. So let me. I work mainly in the U.S. context, so I'll touch a little bit on the international evidence. In the U.S., the policy debate about minimum wages is by and large about helping poor, low-income families. So I have here two quotes which sort of typify the debate. The first one is from the White House recently, when the president, a couple of years ago, first proposed a minimum wage increase, saying raise the minimum wage directly helps parents make ends meet and support their families. And then the second quote is actually from a very nice biography of Senator Edward Kennedy, one of the longtime champions of the minimum wage, saying the minimum wage was one of the first and is still one of the best anti-poverty programs we have. So I think it's not, as Stefano's slides pointed out, that's not the only way to evaluate the minimum wage, but I think it's an important one. So I tend to come at the literature thinking about what does it say about whether minimum wages will achieve this goal. Well, obviously, they might achieve this goal, right, because some minimum wage workers earn a higher wage when you raise the minimum wage. Those workers will be better off. There's clearly some gains to people who earn low wages generated by the system. The potential downside, of course, is that some jobs might be eliminated or fewer jobs created among low-wage, low-skill workers. So if the minimum wage destroys jobs, then there are winners and there are losers. And, of course, most policies, there are winners and losers, and policymakers, of course, are the ones we pay all the big money to make decisions about who wins and who loses. In this particular context, whether minimum wages help poor low-income families, increase incomes for them, is going to depend critically on where in the distribution of family income those workers sit, right? If there is some job loss, where are they? Is it kids in middle-class families? Is it single female heads of poor households? Very different distributional effects. But clearly the effect on the jobs is key, right? If minimum wages don't destroy jobs, as some argue, then it seems like, what economists say there never is, which is a free lunch, right? If minimum wages don't destroy jobs, raising the minimum wage has to help poor and low-income families, even if it does it very inefficiently. So what's the bottom line that I take away from a very large body of research? Certainly many workers, low-skilled workers, retain their jobs, probably don't have much of a serious hours reduction, and as a result earn more after the minimum wage goes up. Right? That's the appeal. That's probably why opinion polls are very strongly in favor of minimum wage increases. Even Republicans in the U.S., not people in Congress, but voters, favor minimum wages, higher minimum wages. The evidence on job loss is certainly not unanimous. It's contested, sometimes contested quite sharply, but I've underlined it here. Evidence from many countries indicates that minimum wages reduce jobs available to low-skilled workers, and I'll clarify a little bit what that evidence says and what I mean by that. The second thing we know, and this is really not contested in the U.S., although we know much less about it in other countries, is that minimum wages are a fairly ineffective way at helping poor, low-income families, and I'll explain why. So let's just go back to theory for one slide. What do we think's going on here? Well, in the competitive model, which, at least we all learned, and some of us learned other models, but in the competitive model, a minimum wage raises the price of low-skilled labor, right? Low-skilled labor becomes relatively more expensive, raises the cost of production, right? Firms then try, to the extent they can, to move away from using low-skilled labor. I have a picture on my phone that I'll incorporate in my class this winter of the ordering stations in the McDonald's on the Champs-Élysées, right, where they've gotten rid of the worker entirely. That's exactly what you would expect to happen. Raises production costs, so firms reduce demand, so that reduces demand for the product on the part of consumers. That leads to a further reduction in the use of low-skilled labor and perhaps other workers, no clear prediction there. And those effects imply certainly less employment of the least skilled workers. Okay? In monopsony models, the world is way more complicated, and in a sense, anything can happen. Minimum wages might reduce employment, they might not reduce employment, it depends on where the wage is, and they certainly make the world more complicated, which is why I'm an empirical guy, right? So I'm always interested in what the evidence says. Economists tend to focus on what we call the minimum wage elasticity, the percent change in employment over the percent change in the minimum wage. You often hear this number from the old, now getting very old U.S. literature, that elasticity is kind of minus 0.1 to minus 0.2, which means if you raise the minimum wage by 10%, employment, not of everybody, but employment of the low-skilled workers, and most studies look at teenagers because they're kind of the lowest skilled, falls by 1 to 2%. That probably carries over to other groups. We actually don't know. Most of the work in the U.S. still, despite all the incredible data we have now, is still about teenagers. So there's actually far fewer studies of what happens to 30-year-old high school dropout females, for example, when the minimum wage goes up. People are always curious, if not bothered, by how much empirical research takes place in the U.S. or takes place using U.S. data. There's a really good reason for it, right? We have 50 states doing their own thing, right, which are uniform in many ways, right, because federal law is the same. So the United States, I'm sure there's some cultural imperialism here as well, but the U.S. is a great laboratory for studying policy because of this, right? Whenever you're trying to estimate the effect of any policy, the inherent problem is always the counterfactual, the comparison group. What would have happened had we not implemented the policy? Because unless we have some idea of what that is, we don't know what the policy did, right? In the U.S., when in the 1990s, a lot of states started raising their own minimum wages, and now it's really 30-some states have their own minimum wage now, above the federal minimum wage. That gave researchers this great tool. Because now you could look at what happens when the minimum wage goes up in one state and not other states, and you could more or less hold the business cycle constant, right? The national business cycle, and that was very important, and that led to this explosion of research. So what does the research say? So this is the slide where I really try to summarize a lot in one place. Bill Washer and I did a very extensive review in 2007, then a shorter version of it's in our book in 2008. We looked at over 100 studies. We got hold of everything written since 1990 that was in English. Those were our criteria. Most of the studies, roughly 2/3, find negative effects. When we look, not always statistically significant, when we use our own subjective assessment as to what are the most credible studies, and we think that's important because some studies aren't very compelling, a much higher percentage, close to 85%, look like there's negative effects. And a lot of the elasticities are in that old range of -0.1 to -0.2. My own view, there's certainly studies to the contrary, and there's a range of studies. But my own view is when you read a reporter or even some lit reviews and papers say, the evidence is sort of balanced 50-50. It's not, right? The evidence leans heavily towards disemployment effects, especially for the U.S., which is not to say it's a settled issue, but that is where the weight of the evidence lies. The effects are strongest on the very least skilled, which is kind of exactly what you'd expect, right? Part of the reason I think studies have heterogeneous effects is they don't always isolate the very least skilled, right? We probably should because they're presumably the ones we're trying to help, right? What you might get instead, which can sort of undermine the results, is what labor economists call labor-labor substitution, right? I may use fewer of the least skilled workers than I used to, and replace them with, maybe for every 4 I get rid of, 3 somewhat higher skilled workers, right? And that's so you're substituting some workers for others. The net effect may be quite small and may in fact be hard to detect statistically, but the gross effect, that is how many of the very low skilled workers lost their jobs, could be a lot higher. And these are just, I won't go through these. These are just some studies. I'm going to skip these 2 slides, these 3 slides actually, 4 slides. There we go. That sort of go through some of the evidence, and you can read about it in the IZA World of Labor paper, which, as Klaus said, is very short and easy to read because they're very well edited. Touch on some recent controversy over this evidence. 2 studies by Allegretto et al. And Dubé et al. They each have a bunch of authors. I won't list them all. Have really gone after not just our work, but in general the state panel data approach very seriously, arguing that there's a problem with what they call spatial heterogeneity, that minimum wages tend to get adopted at the same time as youth labor markets are really getting hit with negative shocks. No idea why that would be the case, but that's the claim. And that leads them to a different empirical approach, which leads to the conclusion, which I quote at the bottom of this slide, that there's no detectable employment losses from the kind of minimum wage increases we've seen in the U.S. It's a pretty strong statement, given all the evidence. The authors of these studies have been very high profile in the minimum wage debate in the U.S., and as evidenced by what's happening. I don't know if you guys follow the local minimum wages, but we now have West Coast cities passing $15 an hour minimum wages. These guys have been very much out there advocating for higher minimum wages based on their research, which is interesting in its own right. We have a paper, Washer and I and a former grad student in the Industrial Labor Relations Review, and another version coming out in one of the IZA journals soon. I'll leave you to read about it. It's a lot of technical details, but we really argue these critiques are unfounded, and the methods they're using really don't hold up to sort of a real careful look at the evidence. So my view is, while there's some heterogeneity effects, there always is. We don't expect research to all point in one direction. there is job loss, right? But that doesn't mean a minimum wage is a bad idea, right? So when you engage in policy debate, the business community, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, says, oh, Newmark studies say, minimum wages reduce jobs, therefore a bad idea. It's not so simple, right? Most government regulations probably cost somebody a job somewhere, right? Climate change policy is going to be really bad for oil rig workers in Texas, right? But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, right? That means there must be some reason we want to do it, some benefit, and let's weigh it against the costs and decide what to do. Now, that's a very hard thing to do. Economists do this in formal models analyzing welfare. I've never met a policymaker who knows what we're talking about when we say that. I find we talk about trade-offs because they have their own trade-offs in mind. And the one they often focus on with the minimum wage is where I started, which is reducing poverty or helping poor or near poor families. Do minimum wages do that successfully? What does the evidence say? Well, if there's one takeaway from these 15 or 13 minutes, I should say I have, and I don't know the extent this is true in other countries, but I'm sure it's true to some extent, being a low-wage worker and being in a low-income family are just not the same thing, right? There's obviously a relationship, right? Low-income families, on average, have more low-wage workers than higher-income families, right? But there's a lot of low-wage workers in non-poor families. And in the U.S., at least, roughly half of poor families with a working-age head of household, so forget the retiree age, roughly half of families with a working-age head of household have 0 workers, right? So the minimum wage probably is going to be very effective for them. What this table here shows you, the right-hand column, is the percentage of low-wage workers, in this case defined as below 7 1/4. This was the federal minimum wage, and well, it still is the federal minimum wage. And what you see here, those first two numbers, the first 3 numbers, 12.7, I'm squinting here, about 22%. About 22% of low-wage workers are in families below 1.5 times the poverty line. Only 13% of minimum wage workers are in poor families, okay? The bottom right-hand number, 44.6%, that says 44% of workers who are in the minimum wage are in families in the top half of the income distribution. Now, median income is nothing to, none of us would be very happy with median income, I suspect, right? But it's roughly 3 times the poverty line in the U.S. And this reflects the fact that a lot of minimum wage workers are teenagers or secondary workers, part-time, second or third worker in a family. So however you cut it, minimum wages don't target the poor well at all. What's the direct evidence? I'll be done in 1 minute. The direct evidence of the effect of minimum wages on poverty, pretty much that there's no effect, right? There's a little variation across studies. There aren't nearly as many studies, but it's hard to look at the evidence and say we know minimum wages reduce poverty. I should say, and we actually conclude our book this way, that when I think about the employment effects of minimum wages, I think those results probably generalize to most countries, right? Demand and supply, the world is more complicated, but that's kind of the way the world works, right? And a lot of evidence from a lot of countries does point to disemployment effects. Again, not all of it. It's not homogeneous across countries. The distributional effects could be very different, right? That's very context-specific, right? You could be a Chicago economist convinced minimum wages reduce employment, and you shouldn't be at all surprised if minimum wages actually reduce poverty, because there's nothing in the theory that says they shouldn't. It's just going to depend on, there's going to be some job loss when the minimum wage goes up. Who are those people? Where are they in the income distribution? And that's going to depend on the wage distribution, the income distribution, the policy context, how policies interact. Very complicated. And I just don't know. In fact, I've done work on living wages in the U.S., which are these city-level policies, and they actually reduce poverty, right? So, and they're quite different. They're much higher, and they affect a sort of narrow subset of workers and not many teenagers. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that you can get a quite different answer. I'm going to stop there. My last couple slides are about the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is what we call generally in-work credits, which I tend to argue is a much better and effective way of encouraging work instead of discouraging work and of targeting low-income families. But I'll hold off because I'm guessing that will come up in the following discussion.
Thank you, David. That was exactly what we had in mind, a very quick overview of the extensive literature in the US. I think thanks also to bring the different dimensions of the possible impact of the minimum wage, not just on the employment, but also the distributional impacts. I'm just looking around for the panel members who want to come in. Francois.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks to David for this very nice and very effective presentation. I have 2 or 3 remarks. The first one is about this minimum wage elasticity, employment elasticity, which in the US is rather low. the evidence that we have in France suggests that the elasticity is much higher. And the hypothesis, the explanation which has been given for that is simply the fact that the minimum wage, as shown in Stefano's slides, is much higher than in the US. So implicitly, the assumption is that this elasticity should depend on the density of the distribution of productivities, I guess. And if you are getting close to the median, then the density is certainly much higher than when you are close to the tail. And this may explain those differences. So I think it would be interesting, and maybe there is some analysis of this type comparing states in the United States to see the way in which that elasticity may depend on the actual level or relative level of the minimum wage. My second point is about the issue of contagion. When we said elasticity refers to people who are at the minimum wage, it's not clear what it means, being at the minimum wage. In the case of France, when there is an increase in the minimum wage, people who are at 1.1, 1.2, and as a matter of fact, until 1.7 minimum wage are getting a raise in their wage. There is some kind of diffusion of the increase in wages. So focusing only on people at the minimum wage may be to some extent misleading. We may be missing part of the effects. And again, because David is a worldwide expert on this, I would like to know his opinion about this. And finally, a remark on poverty and poverty more than income distribution. You say that in the US there is no evidence that the minimum wage would have an impact on poverty. To some extent it is very difficult to imagine that the impact of the minimum wage on poverty would be negative. That the minimum wage would increase poverty. Or we really have to assume that there is an employment effect which is very, very strong. So I would say that my hunch would be to say that poverty may not decrease by that much, but probably it decreases a bit. And there is another issue, which is it depends very much on the way in which you measure poverty. If you measure poverty in terms of the head count, the proportion of people below the poverty line, it may be the case that there are very few people jumping above the poverty line because of the minimum wage. But when you look at people who are below the minimum wage, they have an increase in their standard of living, which means that what we call the poverty gap, which takes into account the average income or standard of living of people below the poverty line, this may increase much more. So I think that our view about the impact of the minimum wage on poverty must be a little more subtle than simply looking, as we very often do, all of us, looking only at the head count.
Thank you, Stefano. I'd like to come back to David's point about really understanding the impacts, because I think this is key here. And I probably have a kind of healthy skepticism for much of the minimum wage literature out there. And I would include my own papers in that as well, I think. So, and the issue is identifying the impacts because of the lack of a good counterfactual. And this is particularly the case in the UK context, where the minimum wage is national. There's no baseline group for which we compare it against. And typically then the studies use these kind of differential type impact approaches. So we might look at spatial variation, but still in the context where you have one minimum rate and variation in some kind of benchmark wage across the rest of the UK. Or we might use microdata to look at individuals who are perhaps more or less affected by changes in the minimum wage. And that's what the UK government relies upon for its evidence. And my sense is it's sort of slightly unsatisfactory, really, that we don't really have kind of clean estimates of these impacts. I imagine the case in France is probably more difficult still, because the minimum itself is linked to things that are going on in the economy, the inflation rate in particular. And so trying to disentangle those effects is probably very, very difficult, I'd imagine, nigh on impossible. There are a bunch of cross-country studies using OECD data. David did one of these original studies some years ago, and that's been updated more recently. But again, there's still concerns about endogeneity, both of the minimum wages in those contexts, but also in the benchmark wages. And so David's right, I guess, to point out that the US is sort of the best playground to be working in if you're going to be looking at minimum wage effects, where you have these state variations, and I guess you might include Canada in that as well, I guess, where there's some variation. And this has been exploited by a number of studies. He's quite critical of the Dubé study, but I think it's a nice development that they're concentrating more on the identification, at least, looking at those border effects. You may not agree with the conclusions or the political kind of motivation of the authors, perhaps, but I think they've taken the literature in a direction that is a welcome direction for the whole literature, and I'm pleased to hear that you've taken up that kind of challenge. And I guess there's now a kind of growing group of micro level and even payroll data analysis of minimum wages, and I think that this is a good departure as well. There's a nice paper by Giuliano in the Journal of Labor Economics last year, and looking at a kind of major retailer. And I think that gives you some of the subtleties of what goes on between different groups of workers, which is quite nice. The differences between teens and adult workers, and actually different types of teens as well, from different types of backgrounds. Francois raised the question of these kind of spillover effects. And I'll let David come back to that, but we do have some evidence in the UK that these tend to be quite limited, that we do find some evidence of spillover effects going up the distribution, but they tend not to be more than about 5 or 6% above the minimum wage, something like this. I shall pass that on. Thank you.
Yeah, as a kind of outside observer of the minimum wage literature, as a consumer, so to speak, for the time being, yes. Since I'm living in Germany and we haven't had the minimum wage, or this type of minimum wage, at least for many years, I'm a little bit puzzled about two things in this literature. One is the ignorance of researchers and also debaters about the macro implications of all what is going on there. Of course, some colleagues like Paul Krugman have recommended to stimulate the growth and the economy by raising the minimum wage. I'm not sure about what kind of using what kind of evidence to supporting that, but at least claiming, we know from all of the program evaluation literature that just looking at the micro level is not so important at all. It's very important to see where the money comes from, what otherwise would have been done, and what the macro implications are. And I think we don't have much evidence here. The other issue is the major objective, at least what people claim who are supporting the minimum wage, is that they want to fight poverty or to increase inequality. Or decrease inequality. Yes, but this implies that one should also have evidence, exact evidence on what's going on here. But most of the research and most of the debate goes on the employment effect. Well, if we want to get more equality, then we may want to get to lose jobs. There's always a price in life. So why is this so important? The really important thing is that we have to show what's happening with poverty, and their wages directly are not relevant. It's how do household members fare after the minimum wage was introduced, and we have to confront this to alternative measures to fight inequality. And well, the evidence we see, at least, that if you look at those who are qualifying for the minimum wage, also in Germany, are not those who are really living in poor income households. The large parts of those people who are obviously benefiting are not living in poor households. And then it's very, very hard to understand why the debates we are looking at are not addressing this issue at all from the beginning. And I'm a little confused and would like to learn more about what you think here.
You want to jump in? Also?
No, I would like to jump in maybe on the last remark by Klaus Zimmermann. I think that we all agree on the fact that the impact of the minimum wage on the distribution is very limited. And as a matter of fact, I had in mind maybe in the second part I will say I will show a few figures on this in the case of France. But this is quite interesting in the sense that people who are benefiting from an increase in the minimum wage, at least in the case of France, are the deciles in the income distribution, which are between 3 and 5 or 6. So you could say that behind that, there is a political economy issue which is quite strong, which is the fact that maybe the official justification of the minimum wage may be poverty reduction, but as it is often the case in political economy models, the middle class is to some extent using this kind of argument in order to push in favor of their own standard of living. And this is something that we cannot really completely disregard when we look at the way in which decisions are being made on the minimum wage.
Jump in with a few things. I mean, that's an interesting conjecture. Having spent a lot of time talking to the media and policymakers, I don't give them nearly that much credit. I think they just think it helps the poor because they think all they think about is the wage increase. That's it. It must help, to some extent, low-income people. But it's an interesting conjecture for sure. Let me just respond real quickly to a couple things, not all the things that came up. I do think the notion that the elasticity is much bigger in France because the minimum wage is higher is certainly possible. There's not really, as I sit here thinking about it, very good evidence on that in the U.S. I have to say, when people talk about $15 hour minimum wages in Seattle and L.A. and Oakland and San Francisco, or close to 15, I do worry that we do get much higher up in the distribution of the density of productivity. You have to say we don't know what's going to happen if the minimum wage goes to $15 an hour in the U.S. because there's no evidence. But I kind of, at the back, the sort of non-statistician hat on me is saying this could be a lot worse than we think for exactly that reason. We'll find out. Richard's point on knock-on effects, contagion, whatever you call it, I think is right. We don't see much of it in the U.S. or the U.K. That's where most of the work has been done. It's conceivable in a union setting where you're collecting, one way or another, what happens to union wages is tied, perhaps even explicitly by contract, to the minimum wage, can give you more of that, and that's something we don't know as much about.
Does it depend also on the level, the knock-on effect, the spillover effect?
I don't know. It could. Yeah, it could, for sure. The poverty question is interesting. You can look at these U.S. elasticities of -0.1 or -0.2 and say, well, income of low-wage people must go up. And the calculation is sort of as follows. If we raise the minimum wage by 10%, let's say 2% of people lose their job, high end, 2% of affected people, right? But everyone else gets a 10% raise. There must be a big net income increase. It's nearly 8%. That's not quite right, though, because it's very funny. Everyone uses this elasticity, but it's actually a really funny number. I often say it's kind of like asking what happens to demand for Macintosh apples. I don't know if you have those here. That's kind of apple. Demand for apples when you raise the price of Macintosh apples. And the answer may be not much. What we really want to know is how does employment of the workers whose wage is affected by the minimum change when the minimum wage is up? And even when you do teenagers, right, the lowest wage group in the U.S., half or two-thirds of them earn well above the minimum wage, right? So that employment effect is actually falling on a much smaller share of people. And you can get elasticities if you do the sort of apples-to-apples comparison, as we say, that are closer to -1. And then if you get some of the job loss, if it's kind of falling on the single poor mothers and not the middle-class teenagers, which is possible, poverty could even go up. I agree with Richard. Identification is tricky. And I agree, and I have said in writing, the Dubé and these guys, by sort of saying we should think about other comparison groups, always a good idea, but we should test what we're doing, and that's kind of my criticism of them. The macro implications, I agree. I mean, Krugman, say what evidence is Krugman using? That's a very loaded question, right? Because the answer is typically none, right? At least in the last few years. I think this notion that a minimum wage stimulates the economy, there's zero evidence to support it. I mean, my response is always, let's just give them checks instead, if that's what we want to do, right? Because it's effectively the same thing. You know, the funny thing about the minimum wage, and this comes back to these distributional effects, is, you know, we're talking about redistribution. Obama's talking about it a lot. It's good. Inequality has gotten ridiculous in the U.S. We should do something. Most people think that's, you know. But the minimum wage is a very funny policy. First of all, it doesn't go to the people at the very bottom, right? That's not a good way to do redistribution. And it doesn't come from the people at the top either, right? It's not the guys at Goldman Sachs who are going to pay for the higher minimum wage. It's people who own small businesses, right? And some of them are rich, and a lot of them, you know, make a lot less than us. So it's a very strange redistributive policy. It's easy for politicians. You don't have to vote for tax increases, which in the U.S. is impossible, and in many countries is difficult. It seems like this sort of, you know, wave the magic wand and we'll get some redistribution. And we might get a little bit. But if we're really dealing with a problem that the people at the top have just made out very well and the people at the bottom have gotten slammed by many of the same forces, it seems like that's where you want the redistribution to be occurring, even if politically it's harder to do.
Thank you. Let me open the floor. Questions from the audience? Tim.
A couple. First,
There is a microphone, I guess, because I think we are recording that. So if you wait for 1 second, it's coming. Now there are two mics.
my name is Tim Smeeting. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a consultant to OECD for this year, for a small portion of myself. The first question has to do with trying to explain why the minimum wage is so popular then, everywhere. I mean, in the United States anyway, where it is really low, it's very, very popular. And the second thing is the way the labor market's been changing since 2008. We've created a whole lot of more jobs in the United States that are part-time, low-wage, in retail sectors. That's been 2/3 of the net jobs created. And those jobs are affected a lot by the minimum wage. And quite often when you have in-work benefits, employers understand this. They know you've got kids, and they take advantage of the fact that you're getting an in-wage benefit and hold your wages down. So I think the case, I would probably agree with about 90% of what David said, but I still think that some of the points that are being made by Francois and Richard really deserve more attention. But maybe you could just answer the question, why does it seem to be so popular among everybody? Literally.
I thought Francois and I agreed on almost everything we said, not Richard as much. But anyways, I don't know. You know, it's not what I do, understanding public opinion. I really don't know. I would say two things. You know, I don't think the EITC quite works that way. I mean, we don't really find child penalties in U.S. wage data, for example. I mean, certainly the EITC pushes down the market wage, right? So the EITC, we're holding more credits. What it does in the U.S., I actually have a slide. Can you hand me that thing real quick, since my slides are still up? Many of you know this picture. It's in here somewhere. Here it is. So this is the earned income tax credit. The right hand, the horizontal axis is your labor market earnings at the family level. The vertical axis is what you get in benefits from the federal government. And you can see the child list, that little yellow thing on the bottom, you get essentially nothing. But if you have 2 or 3 kids, that's a really big pyramid, missing its top, right? So you now get, up to if you have 3 kids, over $6,000 if you're earning about $12,000. It's a massive subsidy. Now, what does that do? It increases labor supply. That's why poor women start working, poor women with kids. That does reduce market wages for everyone. Now, obviously, the people who are induced to enter the labor market because of that are better off, or they wouldn't be entering the labor market. But if you're somebody without kids, you're making less, right? So the EITC does pose these distributional trade-offs. I should point out that the research I didn't talk about that Washer and I did on minimum wage EITC interactions actually says that when you use the two policies together, you can improve the distributional effect. So when someone like me sort of insists that the evidence says minimum wage reduce employment, that doesn't mean for every kind of worker, right? So if you think about sort of the mother with 2 kids, there's a very high cost of working, right? High minimum wage may not get her into the labor market. High EITC alone, both of which raise her wage, may not. but both together might. We actually find that when states have raised the two together, you get increasing participation of sort of low-skilled women with kids, reduced poverty in terms of earnings, even before you factor in the EITC. But we're economists, there's a trade-off. The teenagers really get hammered when you do that, because now the teenagers are getting hit by the high minimum wage and the increased competition from low-skilled mothers. So, now we may say distributionally, that's fine. But again, you can't. Kind of what I always say, it was my last slide, I didn't get to it, is the policy debate should be about what are the costs and benefits. It shouldn't go on with this claim that there's no disemployment effects, because then it's sort of a no-brainer, right? There are effects, who they fall on, and is that a good idea or a bad idea, kind of things we need to really be wrestling with.
Thank you, Klaus.
Well, just three arguments to the question, why is it so popular, at least from my understanding of following the debate in various countries, also at the moment in Germany. First, it's behind a very simple argument for decision makers. Well, people should be able to live from their own hands of work. Yes, so that is a very convincing argument at the beginning. Second, well, that's the same what François already mentioned. Other groups in society who are very powerful, trade union members, but also middle class, who earn more, are supported effectively in the long term by raising the minimum wage, because the wage distribution cannot stay where it is. So the upper part of the wage distribution has to shift upwards. Actually, it's really part of the argument of fighting for the minimum wage is to make sure that the upper income classes don't move down in the future. So there's a political economy game going on at this stage, which is in favor of completely different groups. And last but not least, the whole issue is not very transparent. Nobody understands what goes on, and that is why at the end this is so popular, because otherwise people would understand that somebody has to pay for this, and that these are not the groups these are not the rich. This was already mentioned. So that is, I think, in total, at least in my view, explains why it is so easy to get support for that policy.
Just to say that much of this debate has been about the impacts on inequality and poverty, and I'm not sure everyone else outside of this room sees the minimum wage quite in the same way as us. And I think there are issues around just a kind of fair wage and there being some fairness for employment. The UK had, before the minimum wage was introduced, fairly high levels of extreme low pay, people on very, very low wages, and that's been eradicated. It may not have done much for their poverty status, but I think that's one of the reasons that politicians in particular, and maybe the general public, are in favour of these things.
Thank you, Richard. Let's move into the second part of our discussion. I think there was some degree of sort of consensus among the panel members here about how difficult it is to identify the effect of the minimum wage. That's why there's a lot of literature in the US. There's perhaps less in other countries. The fact that the effect on the employment might be very different from one group to another, so we really have to go beyond the aggregate and look at different groups. The fact that there might be some non-linearity in the effect of the minimum wage depending on the level of the minimum wage, and the fact that the distributional impact, which is certainly one of the elements we should pay a lot of attention to, may be very much country-specific. And I think David, to some extent, already introduced the issue for the second part of our discussion, which is about, let's assume that there is indeed a minimum wage. How do we set it? How do we adjust it over time? And how do we actually look at possible interactions with other policy instruments? I think also Klaus mentioned an important element, which is the political economy of the minimum wage. Why it is so popular, why 25 of the 34 countries of the OECD actually do have a statutory minimum wages at a very different level, I think, as we showed before, and actually adopt very different policies in how they adjust the minimum wage over time. So why don't we start with you, François, if you want to share with us your experience also as a chair of the Commission on the SMIC.
Okay, thank you very much. We already discussed a couple of things. I will not come back on the issue of the elasticity and maybe the impact on the distribution. But let me start with maybe the process, the minimum wage setting process, and the way in which it works in France, because it is quite different from the way in which it works in the UK. And from what I know, it will be very different from the way in which it will be working in Germany if we stick to Europe for the moment. What is important in the case of France is that, in this matter, it's usual to talk about rules versus discretion. And in France, as it is often the case in this country, the rule is very important. So there is basically a rule for the minimum wage which says the following. It says that from a year to the next, the real minimum wage, after deflating by the consumer price index, must increase by at least half of the real average wage in the economy. So if you look at these rules, this means that if there is no discretionary additional increase in the minimum wage, over time there should be some kind of divergence between the average wage and the minimum, since every year the minimum wage would only get half of the increase of the average. Now this explains why periodically there is some discretionary increase in the minimum wage. And practically, and here we are close to the political economy and the politics of the minimum wage, when you look at what happened in France since the crisis in 2008 until now, you'll find that the minimum wage has been more or less following exactly the average wage, despite the rule, simply because there has been a couple of discretionary increases which coincided with changes in administrations, and this explains why there is no difference. And we don't really know whether the minimum wage is affecting the way in which the average wage is increasing, or whether it is the opposite, or whether we have a rather complex circular relationship between the minimum and the average. This is something which is not very well analyzed and which is very, very difficult for the reasons which have been mentioned before, difficult to analyze. A second point which I think is important is that the minimum wage, in comparison with some other countries, the minimum wage is uniform. It works for absolutely everybody, whatever your age, whatever your gender, you will receive exactly the same minimum wage. This is, I think, a constraint in comparison with other countries, which I believe is important. Now, about the process by which the minimum wage is being set, I am, as Stefano said, I'm chairing an expert group, which every year is making a recommendation to a commission which is responsible for bargaining about the minimum wage at the end of the year, who are providing a report with, at the end, some recommendation about what should be done with the minimum wage. Should we go beyond the rule, or should we stick to the rule? And then the commission takes place. What we call in France the social partners are bargaining, and at the end, the government decides about what will happen on 1st of January of the following year. And the government may decide to follow the expert group, or may decide to use its discretion to push the minimum wage. This is the way in which it works. Today, the number of people, so we already said that the minimum wage growth is more or less 60% of the median wage. There are more or less 11%, maybe 12% of wage workers who are receiving the minimum wage, or who are below, between 1 and 1.1 minimum wage. And as it was said by Stefano in his presentation, when instead of looking at how much workers are receiving, you look at how much employers are paying, then there is a small difference. The cost of labor at the minimum wage is not so close to the median cost of labor, basically, and this is a very important point in the case of France, basically because there is a very heavy subsidy of employment at the minimum wage level. Basically, the subsidy takes the form of a tax credit on social security contributions by employers. Today, we are close to have at most 10% social security contribution at the level of the minimum wage, when the average proportion is close to 50%. So the subsidy is absolutely enormous. So we are in a situation, in the case of France, where we are subsidizing the minimum wage through public finance, through taxes which are really levied on the whole population, which I think is an interesting situation which very few people realize at this stage in the case of France. Now, a few additional words on some issues on the effects of the minimum wage, which we didn't discuss so much. First, about the spillover. The reason why we have a big spillover in the case of France is because the minimum wage happens to be more or less at the bottom of the wage scale in most sectors of the economy. So when there is an increase in the minimum wage, in general, companies or sectoral employer organizations would increase the income scale more or less proportionally to the minimum wage. And this explains why there is this kind of spillover from the minimum wage to levels of wages which are much higher than the minimum wage. This is something quite important, and this means that the minimum wage, in the case of France, plays a much wider role than protecting low-wage people. It is part of a kind of national wage negotiation. And this is, again, an important feature of the minimum wage here. We discussed, and Klaus raised the issue of macro versus micro. It is true that most of the estimates which are available of the elasticity, employment elasticity of the minimum wage are based on micro analysis, partial analysis. It is very difficult to get any kind of evidence at the macro level because the counterfactual is almost by definition non-existent. But at least we can play with macro models and trying to see exactly what is the impact of that. Now, lately, the issue of the minimum wage is very important in the case of France because many people say we need to push that economy because growth is very sluggish. So one way would be to increase the minimum wage. This will increase demand, and through that we will be able to increase tax receipts, etc., and the economy will do much better. But of course, if we do that, at the same time, we will have an impact on employment. So there are positive effects and negative effects. And there is one very important impact, which again seems to be disregarded in very much of that discussion, which is the public finance cost of increasing the minimum wage. Because of the subsidy I mentioned before to people, to workers, or to employers employing people at the minimum wage and slightly above it, because of this subsidy, then any increase in the minimum wage means that the government will have to pay more for the subsidy. And when you take into account the fact that maybe there will be some multiplier effect, a Keynesian-type multiplier effect behind an increase in the minimum wage, on the other hand, there may be some negative employment effect, and on top of that, you have the public finance effect. The overall impact is very ambiguous, and in any case, is most likely to be extremely small. And this is where we stand from that point of view in the case of France. One final word about poverty and the minimum wage. One thing which is, and this is, I think, a very important issue which has already been slightly alluded to. One important thing is that when we think about the minimum wage as an anti-poverty tool, we have to remember that there are other anti-poverty tools. And David has talked about the EITC in the United States. In the case of France, we have something which is very similar to the EITC. But on top of that, and as in several other European countries, we have minimum income guarantees. And these minimum income guarantees are means tested, which means that if you increase the minimum wage, then part of the subsidy, part of the transfer received by low-income people will disappear, which means that there is a marginal tax rate on the minimum wage, which is very, very far from negligible. As a matter of fact, we estimate that at the bottom of the distribution of standard of living, the marginal tax rate on 1 additional euro of wages would be something like 40%. So when we look at the impact of the minimum wage on poverty, we have to take into account the fact that true low-income people will be partly expropriated from the minimum wage increase through that drop in the transfer that they're receiving. And let me end up with a final remark on one of the problems that I believe is present, at least in our country, and maybe in other countries, which is there is a kind of poverty trap because of this coexistence of anti-poverty tools. If we look at somebody with a very low productivity, let's say productivity which would be below the minimum wage, then this person will be living on minimum income transfers. And if we want to incentivize that person to take a job through EITC kind of policies, this person will not be able to do that simply because the productivity level of that person is below the minimum wage. So the minimum wage, the coexistence of a minimum wage and minimum income guarantee is creating a kind of trap. There are people right at the minimum income who cannot get out of that simply because their productivity is much below the minimum wage. And this is something which has not been very well analyzed, I think, in the French case, which really results from this coexistence of different anti-poverty tools. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Oops. Okay. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the wage setting process in the UK. As probably many of you already know, we have something called the Low Pay Commission that was set up back in 1997 under the old Labour government. And they set about essentially designing and then coming up with the initial rates. And then year on year, that commission is the body that makes a recommendation to government of what the rate should be, what the minimum rate should be. It's very clear that it's independent of government. So we're independent members. We are appointed through a kind of proper governmental appointments process, and it has this social partnership structure where we have there's 9 members of the commission. We have 3 from the employee side, 3 from the employer side, and a chair plus 2 independents, and those independents tend to be academics, which I'm one of those. And although it has this structure, we're there as individuals, and it's essentially one commissioner, one vote. So we adhere to the kind of aims of the commission, but obviously individuals representing certain sides are likely to have certain views. There's no actual overall aim for the commission. We receive a remit from government every year, which tends to make a recommendation about the rates for next year. It may have certain side issues. So this year we've been asked to look at the structure of the youth and the apprentice rates. But the Commission themselves came up with this kind of guiding principle a number of years ago in their report, which was essentially to help as many low-paid workers as possible without any significant impact on employment or the economy. So how do we go about doing that? There's a range of analysis that happens and consultation, and I guess this is what adds some credibility to the recommendation that then goes to government. You know, there's a lot that goes behind the recommendation that's made to government. It's then very hard for the government to turn around and say, you know, a panel of experts have looked at this, commissioned their own in-house analysis, independent research from academics. There's been a consultation process. We meet with stakeholders. We go on site visits around the UK and meet low-paid workers and their employers. And we look at international developments and also what's going on with other policies that interact with the minimum wage. And so I guess this kind of evidence-based approach is what gives the Commission its credibility with government. And generally, government has accepted every recommendation that's been made. There's one or two instances over the years where, around the kind of youth rates and apprentice rates, where that hasn't happened. Okay. One thing I would say is that the structure is pretty simple. There's only 4 rates in the UK. There's an adult rate that's paid from 21 plus, and then there's a couple of youth rates and an apprentice rate. Okay. And those youth rates, contrary to what we see in France, they have quite an offset. So 16 and 17-year-olds are approximately 60% of the adult minimum wage. 18 to 20-year-olds are about 80%. So that enables us, in a sense, to think about differentiating those rates much more in a way. And I think what it enables you to do is to think about, if you are interested in poverty concerns, then probably the adult rate is the best way of targeting that. And some have actually called for us looking for an even higher age rates, perhaps starting at 30 or 35, whereas if productivity is higher there, you could start to think about pushing a minimum wage up at that level that would perhaps better target the issues of inequality and poverty that we've been talking about. It's proved to be a very popular policy. There was talk of doom and gloom before it came in 15 years ago. The Conservative Party were very much against the introduction of the minimum wage. They're now on side. We see that the policy itself raises the pay of about 1 million workers each year in the UK. It's set at about, the bite is about 53%, which is compared to the 60% in France. Although we have to take into account the gross and the net issue that Francois just raised. There's been evidence that it's reduced inequality in wages, and it's eradicated extreme low pay. And I guess there's little evidence of any significant adverse effects on employment. There's some evidence that there's been some small reductions in hours of work, and some evidence of reductions in job retention amongst part-time female workers, who are one of the groups who are most affected by the minimum wage. And there's going away from the employment issue. You know, if there aren't costs in employment, who's paying for this? Essentially, we see some increases in prices of minimum wage goods. The evidence there isn't super strong, and we see some evidence of a squeeze on profits of firms that are more likely to employ minimum wage workers. Okay. So what for the future? In a sense, the minimum wage has become a bit of a victim of its own success. And as we've gone into recession and this kind of cost of living crisis has hit, and we've seen flat real wage growth, we've seen politicians kind of jump on the bandwagon of the minimum wage as perhaps a way of talking about pay more generally and sort of addressing the living crisis, the cost of living crisis more generally. And we're starting to get much more political interference into the Low Pay Commission now. And so last January, I think it was, George Osborne intervened after the government had submitted their evidence to the Low Pay Commission. He intervened with a talk of a £7 an hour minimum wage. We see the British Labour Party now are looking at some kind of target, which may be similar to the French system in a way, where you link it to the median or the mean wage. And they've talked about an £8 an hour minimum wage through the next Parliament, although if you take the end date of that Parliament, that's not actually so far out of the bounds of what we've seen over recent years in terms of increases. So I guess there's now a concern over the future of this social partnership with this political interference. And I've only been on the Commission since June, but colleagues tell me this is the most politicised year that they've experienced in terms of external pressure to push up rates. And we shall see.
Well, thank you, Richard. I think we have heard about two commissions with different roles, but also different constraints in which they operate. I think throughout the two presentations, there was a lot of political economy issues at stake, in other words. What are the concerns and what are the constraints under which the two commission work? What are the parameters they can play with? But also, I think both of you mentioned the importance of looking at other tools, at other instruments that are available, that are there, that may interact actually with any sort of with the minimum wage and any change in the minimum wage itself. But I think, Richard, I like your final point about the fact that the minimum wage in the UK is becoming a victim of its success, in the sense that in a political, as soon as you move into general election and so on, of course, is one of the instruments that receive a lot of attention from policymakers on both sides of the aisle. Klaus, a new commission will be introduced in Germany next year. How do you see that?
Well, I see it. I would welcome that this commission would listen to independent evaluations. At the beginning, the government had not planned to have any evaluation of the minimum wage policies, but finally gave in to allow for that. Now, in between, on the way to the decision, the plan is to have a commission to work. It will not have a strong role for scientists in this commission. It's more a commission which allocates the social partners to find a solution. And the idea is that they would largely follow what the normal negotiation process between the social partners would bring in general. So there might be not a formula used like in France, but something more automatic following the general bargaining process. That's at least what we understand so far. I personally think that the role of scientists is outside of a committee. I understand that the UK system looks quite successful, I would argue, from what has been done, but the role of scientists is to give independent advice, and various different researchers or institutions should provide evidence what these measures are doing. However, the social responsibility has to be carried by the social partners and by the policymakers at the end, because they have been elected, they introduced that system, and that's why that should stay at the end at this level. That is my, at least, position in that debate. We should stay out of this cooking process, be critical or positive in what we see, but remain independent. Because as soon as you're part of the decision-making process, if this commission is not an independent institution which can be heard or not heard, but it's really doing the process, yes, replacing the policymakers, then that's not what I think how the process should be organized. But at least I would like to conclude that the way the British Commission was introduced and was working is at least a positive model for dealing it, to start low and carefully evaluate the effects and then move on. In Germany, we plan to do the opposite, to have a radical, strong jump into a very relatively high minimum wage, 15% about or so of the work population are affected. In some areas, more than 30%. Of the workforce. That is quite significant if you cannot evaluate also carefully. We are now going down into a recession, maybe across Europe, also in Germany. The situation is less well, so we will not be able to separate easily this general increase of or the introduction of a large minimum wage from other effects.
Thank you, Klaus. Maybe a question to all of you, because I think this has been a fascinating discussion, right? And we have just put on the table how complex it is to assess what the effect of the minimum wage could be. Now, when we go into communication, I mean, both of you are members of commission that advise sort of the tripartite and then government about whether or not to change the minimum wage and so on. I think what actually gets to the general public is whether or not the minimum wage is raised, right? But then I think there are a number of other key elements to actually provide to the general public, I'm talking here, about what will be the implication, or even not to raise the minimum wage at all, what would be the implication of actually raising maybe the minimum wage in terms of distribution effect, in terms of public finance that Francois was mentioning, in terms of some groups that might be more affected than others by the possible disemployment effect. So beyond writing a very good evidence-based, sound from an econometric point of view papers, what else do you think Commission can do to actually somewhat widen the knowledge base of the people that then will assess whether or not the government is doing the right thing about the minimum wage? I mean, you pointed out, Klaus, that Germany is starting like, as France, I think, did, with a minimum wage which is already fairly high, which will limit any role, I guess, of the Commission. But I think what is the scope of, and what is the best way in which we can actually increase, bring other key elements onto the table to facilitate dialogue on a more solid basis rather than just minimum wage, yes or no, minimum wage, at what level, should we raise it or not?
Right. Well, I'd say quickly, we don't do any of this in the U.S., right? We do this purely for political reasons. So in the height of the Great Recession, we had three increases way bigger than you guys, I think, have ever contemplated in these countries, right? Which sort of seems nuts. So in some sense, I find it very interesting thinking about these, the economists involved in policy setting, because on the one hand, I sort of say, dirty work, we shouldn't be doing that at all. But on the other hand, it brings a lot more rationality in the process. But I think your point is a good one, right? Does the Commission become sort of since all we do is recommend an increase, we're going to squish down all our dissent, and I'm sure there's discussions among your Commission members and all these other issues, because all we got to do is recommend the number. And do you then end up with sort of these people playing less of a role in, broadening the policy debate, or is there a channel to say, we're the guys and gals appointed by the government to talk about minimum wages, and we want to put out stuff about, even if it's not our mandate, right now to say what should the increase be, we want to take on sort of an educational function and talk about all these issues, or does that happen more in the sort of U.S. free-for-all when researchers just put out whatever they want because none of us are tied to, the government process?
I think in the UK, as commissioners, we're sort of discouraged, really, from talking directly to the public about these issues. But the Commission themselves produces reports that go to the press, and they look at a range of issues rather than just the key headline stuff. I think, I think probably the press has got very interested in this, as I said, because of the kind of cost of living issue and the flat real wage growth we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, and I think that's sort of heightened interest in all of these things, in minimum wages, living wages, and so on. And so the public profile of these things has become much more important. And I guess it's the job of us as academics to guide what goes out into that debate, and that there's this kind of sensible information out there for individuals to make decisions and think about these things.
Yes, I'm afraid that it is very difficult to have this kind of analysis behind a recommendation about what should be done with the minimum wage being channeled to the public. As in the UK, our group is making a very thorough analysis of the minimum wage, of its implications, its effects. We are we are commissioning studies by administrations, possibly by academics. So this is a very, very thorough job. But at the end of the day, what will be in the public debate will be, do you increase the minimum wage or not? By how much? That's all. We know that. And when we, in this group, once a year at least, we have interviews with stakeholders, and in particular with the unions. And very systematically, one of us is asking the union representative, but are you aware of the fact that the minimum wage may not be the best instrument to fight poverty? Because the argument they have is, in our world, we should have people with a decent wage, and a decent wage is not so much. It is 30% above what the minimum wage is today. And then we're telling them, but look, there are other ways you can fight poverty, and we have the equivalent of the AITC, etc., etc. And they simply don't listen. And the point is simply that, and this is the point I made a little earlier, the fact is that the minimum wage now is very much linked to the, it is not a negotiation about how much should be receiving low-paid workers. It is something about what is a general wage level. And this is obviously a national political issue. And we know that the day after we will have our report will be public, the discussion will not be on the fact that the report is saying that the impact of the minimum wage on the distribution is very, very ambiguous or does not really help poverty. At the end of the day, it will be by how much you increase the minimum wage. And we don't agree with this low increase. And then employers will say this is too much. And that's it.
Hello, David Grubb from the OECD. This is a question to Francois and to Klaus. And first to Francois, you said the minimum wage in France is uniform, but I believe a large proportion of youth employment in France is not actually paid the minimum wage because they are on stagiaire, apprentices, and in active labour market policy measures, all of which are exempt. The related question for Germany is where does the minimum wage stand in relation to apprentice wages, and is it a reasonable fear that young people will be not so willing to accept apprenticeships when they are aware that they're being paid less than well under the minimum wage in the early years of an apprenticeship?
Yes, on this way of trying to bypass the minimum wage for young people, it is true that what we call the stagiaire, internship status, allows an employer to pay young people at a lower level than the minimum wage. Now, it is not clear what proportion of youth employment is with this kind of status. But in general, stagiaire would not be would in fact in general be people who have gone to the university, and this would concern more the upper part of the, let's say, educational scale than the lower part. Now, in the lower part, you may have the status of the apprenticeship status, which again allows an employer to employ somebody below 18 at less than the minimum wage, but at 18 they should switch to the minimum wage. So this is an important point because we ask ourselves whether there would be some this kind of bypassing practice would be very frequent, but at this stage we don't have a precise answer, but we don't have the intuition that this is really big.
The situation in Germany is that we have a policy of no exceptions. So only long-term unemployed for half a year can move out of circulation. The minimum wage can be paid until 18, and then cannot be paid until 18. So if you start an apprenticeship earlier, that is covered by the exemption, but after that, all contracts have to follow the minimum wage. If you look at reality, a large group of young people who are, of course, a large share of all of those who are affected by the minimum wage, are starting their apprenticeship later. So that will have an effect on the choices. At least so far we can judge that from the information we have so far.
I think we are running out of time, but this is a fashion discussion, so I think Francois has another question.
Yes, I had a question to Klaus. I think it's quite interesting to this estimate of 15% of the people in Germany being concerned by this future minimum wage. This minimum wage in Germany is below the minimum wage in France, and I'm sure that if we go to the median, it is still the case that in proportion of the median, it is lower. And in France, we have only 11%. Now, what could be the explanation of that? Will it be the case that today, 15% of the people before the minimum wage is implemented are below the 8.5 euros. But the day the minimum wage will be implemented, then many of those people will lose their job, which means that among the people who remain employed, you will not have any more 15%, but less. I mean, did you try to make this kind of analysis? Because, I mean, the difference is really big.
The endogeneity of the incident.
Yeah.
I understand. My position here, by looking at the data, who is currently amongst those who are earning €8.50 or below. If you look at those people, these are not the people which follow the image we have from poor people. These are not people who are, working for a family and full-time and have a low education. These are, to a large extent, students, housewives, pensioners, second and third, job holders, and so on. This is a quite different group of people. So let's say my son was working for a long time in a supermarket as a student for €6.50. Now, if he should be paid €8.50, he is not fired. It's the people who are above the €8.50 level, who are full-time working. Only a small share of those who are currently working at below the minimum wage are really full-time workers and live on this. This is the explanation. So I'm not expecting in practice. I mean, there are lots of people, millions. I mean, with 100,000 work with an hourly wage of €4, for instance. Lots of people work for an hourly wage of €4. These are not the type of people we are typically have in our head if you think about poor people. So that has to be judged. So I think the large effect in Germany might perhaps come. I mean, we have no good analysis on that by the effects on the workers, full-time workers above the current, the new minimum wage of €8.50.
Thank you, Klaus. I think this concludes our seminar. Let me thank again our panelists, Francois Bourguignon, Richard Dickens, David Newmark, Klaus Zimmermann. I think it was a first step into our collaboration with the IZA, the Institute for the Study of Labor. The good things about sort of moderating a seminar is that you don't have to provide conclusions, but I really want to thank you all for participating today, and I think I will just say à la prochaine for the next seminar. Thank you very much.
Substitute.